For a band known for thunderous guitars, impossible drum parts, and crowds that can sing every word, the most powerful moment in Philadelphia may have been the moment nobody was singing at all. On August 24th, 2026, Rush walked onto the stage at Philadelphia's Xfinity Mobile Arena for the first of two 50-something shows in the city. And this wasn't just another stop on a tour. It was Rush's first full-length Philadelphia performance in more than a decade, and their first without Neil Peart. Geddy Lee and Lifeson were back, with German drummer Anika Nilles taking the seat behind the kit. The atmosphere was already emotional before the first note was played. Then came the moment. Early in the set, Rush played Bravado, a song that has taken on an entirely different meaning since Peart's death in 2020. On this tour, the song has been associated with a tribute to the legendary drummer, making it more than just another entry on the set list. And Philadelphia had every reason to feel that weight. These fans had waited years to see Rush again. Now they were watching Geddy and Alex continue the music without the man who had been their drummer, lyricist, and creative partner for decades. For a few seconds, the noise of a massive rock concert seemed to give way to something much heavier. Remembrance. And that is where this Philadelphia story really begins, because the silence wasn't about the music stopping. It was about everyone remembering who was missing. But Philadelphia wasn't simply watching a reunion. They were watching history being rewritten in real time. Rush had deliberately structured the 50-something tour around two set concerts, drawing songs from across their enormous catalog, rather than treating the shows like a standard greatest hits package. The Philadelphia setlist followed that idea, moving from Xanadu and the Spirit of Radio into the Analog Kid, Free Will, and Subdivisions. And then came Bravado. For longtime Rush fans, that song already carried emotional weight, but on this tour, it was preceded by a Neil Peart tribute collage, a deliberate reminder that although Rush had returned, the lineup could never be exactly the same. That contrast was impossible to ignore. Anika Nilles was now behind the drums, facing the enormous challenge of performing music created by one of rock's most celebrated drummers. Yet the show wasn't presented as an attempt to erase Peart. Instead, the tribute moments made his absence part of the experience, and Philadelphia understood that. The crowd had spent years wondering whether they would ever hear Geddy Lee and Lifeson perform these songs together again. Now they were standing inside an arena, hearing them live and hearing those songs with a completely new chapter attached to them. That is why the reaction to Bravado mattered. It wasn't simply applause. It was the kind of attention that happens when thousands of people realize they are witnessing something they may never experience again. And somehow, the next part of the night made that feeling even stronger. Then came the images. As the stage went dark, the enormous screens began showing a tribute to Neil Peart. It wasn't simply a name appearing on a screen. It was a visual journey through the drummer's life and his years with Rush. And then the band moved into Bravado. That sequence had already become one of the defining emotional moments of the 50-something tour. Reviews from the tour's opening shows described the Neil Peart tribute as deeply moving, with images and video appearing before the performance. For Philadelphia, though, there was another layer. This was the band's first Philadelphia show of the comeback tour, and it came after more than a decade away from the road. Rush had last performed there years before Peart's death. Now Geddy Lee and Lifeson were standing on that stage again, carrying the music forward, with Anika Nilles behind the drums. And Nilles had an almost impossible job. She wasn't trying to become Neil Peart. She was stepping into music history while playing parts that generations of fans had memorized note for note. That distinction mattered, because when the spotlight fell on the stage and the pictures of Peart filled the screens, fans weren't simply comparing drummers. They were remembering a person, a bandmate, a songwriter, a man whose words and rhythms had been part of their lives for decades. And for those few moments, the usual concert reaction, screaming, singing, phones in the air, gave way to something much quieter. The music was still there, but so was the absence. And that silence may have said more than any cheer ever could. But there was something else happening in Philadelphia that night. The silence surrounding Neil Peart wasn't the only emotional layer. Rush themselves were confronting the reality of their return. This was the band's first tour in 11 years, and the first full Rush tour since Peart's death in 2020. Geddy Lee and Lifeson had made the decision to return, but they weren't pretending that nothing had changed. Anika Nilles was now behind the drum kit, while keyboardist Lauren Gold joined the touring lineup, and Philadelphia got a particularly revealing version of that new era. The August 21 setlist moved from Subdivisions into Bravado, followed by Caravan, La Villa Strangiato, The Trees, and Limelight. Think about that sequence. 1 minute, the crowd was hearing some of Rush's most recognizable material. The next, they were being reminded of the man whose drumming had helped define those songs. And yet, Nilles wasn't shrinking from the challenge. Philadelphia's Inquirer noted that the skepticism surrounding Rush's return had largely disappeared because fans had been so impressed by Nilles' performances, and that may be one of the most important parts of this story. The audience wasn't being asked to forget Neil. They were being asked to accept that Rush could honor him while continuing forward. And somehow, in that arena, thousands of fans seemed to understand exactly what that meant, because the silence wasn't rejection, it was respect. And as the first set continued, that respect was about to turn into something much louder. Then the night kept moving. After Bravado, Rush didn't retreat into nostalgia. They pushed forward, launching into Caravan, La Villa Strangiato, The Trees, and eventually Limelight. But the emotional weight never completely disappeared, because by this point, fans had witnessed something unusual. Rush was playing these songs with a new drummer, while openly acknowledging the musician who had made so many of them legendary. And then came the second set. The band launched into the complete 21-112 suite, from overture through grand finale. After that came Animate, Closer to the Heart, A Passage to Bangkok, and Time Stands Still. For longtime fans, that was the payoff. This wasn't a tribute concert pretending to be Rush. This was Rush. Geddy Lee was still commanding the stage. Lifeson was still delivering those unmistakable guitar parts, and Anika Nilles was proving that the music could continue without pretending Neil Peart had never existed. That balance may be what made Philadelphia so emotional. The band wasn't replacing the past, they were carrying it. And when The Garden arrived later in the second set, followed by Tom Sawyer, the emotional journey had transformed into celebration. The silence had given way to something else entirely. Thousands of voices, thousands of memories, and one unmistakable message. Rush was back, but there was still one final moment waiting at the end of the night, and it brought everything back to where the story began. Eventually, the night reached its final moments. After more than 3 hours of music, Rush brought the Philadelphia performance toward its conclusion with Tom Sawyer, Bytor and the Snow Dog, and Working Man. The August 21 setlist confirms that the show ended with one final Neil Peart tribute, and that is what makes the Philadelphia story so powerful. This wasn't simply a rock concert, it was a reunion with history. Geddy Lee and Lifeson had returned to the stage after 11 years away, joined by Anika Nilles and keyboardist Lauren Gold. The tour was explicitly created to celebrate Rush's music while honoring the legacy of Neil Peart, who died in 2020. For Philadelphia fans, the emotional journey had come full circle. They had screamed for the classics. They had watched Nilles take on some of Rush's most demanding material. They had heard songs that hadn't been performed live in years, and they had remembered Neil. So perhaps the most important thing about that famous silence isn't whether every person in the arena literally stopped making a sound, it's what that moment represented. For a few seconds, the crowd wasn't demanding another song. They weren't thinking about the next guitar solo. They were simply remembering the man who helped make Rush what it became. And then, the applause came. Not because the past had been replaced, but because it had been honored. Rush couldn't bring Neil Peart back, but in Philadelphia, they proved something else. His music could still fill an arena. And maybe that's why, after all these years, Rush fans still weren't ready to say goodbye.